All right, good afternoon. I'm Tracy Clecla Jimenez. I teach Spanish here at Central Lakes College, and I'm so happy to see you all, especially from Staples Motley here. I'm really happy to see you all here. I just wanted to put in a plug for a travel study program that we have going to Mexico next March during spring break, the CLC spring break. March 8th through the 16th. It's coming in at a very affordable, much more affordable than some of the other travel study programs. So if you're interested, please see me after the program and I can get you some more information. I met the Caudillo family a long time ago and then ended up, when I took the job here teaching at CLC, I was placed in a class with Antonio so that I could learn how to teach the class. The class is called Many Faces of Mexico. In fact, I think Antonio and I were in the same study group, and I kind of knew the family already. A stellar family. I really love all of them, at least the ones I know. I met Antonio's sister as well. She was a student at Staples Motley High School, and I still call him Bon Bon, but Rafael now is just a couple years younger than you. Antonio was a student here at CLC and had Jan Kurtz as his instructor, and is learning more about the history of Mexico from Jan. This program is a wonderful program, and now has gone on to learn even more, and he's going to share what he knows about immigration and our relationship, our country's relationship between Mexico and the United States, which is really quite fascinating and unique and important for all of us. So please join me. And also, if you haven't already turned this off, would you please do that? And join me in thanking Antonia for coming today to speak with us.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here to this Cultural Thursday. This one's a different one for me because I've been on the other side so many times. When she approached me a couple months ago to do it, I felt like I owed the CLC this. I remember coming to Gary Payne's Cultural Thursdays for Cuba and learning about the educational system and all of this stuff. I remember doing hearing about Vietnam. I remember hearing Native American chant. And I always look forward to the Cultural Thursdays. And when I first started working on this, I thought about showing you guys statistics, and I thought about showing you guys different aspects and making an argument for immigration. But those statistics are always going to be out there. You can just go online and find them. You can take a research methods class and find out about the economics and how the Latino population in the U.S. is helping the economy grow. You can read about any of that stuff. So what I thought was best was to talk about my personal story and how my family has been affected by different immigration policies. There's three particular ones that I'm going to speak on, but there's many more that are out there that affect all kinds of immigrants, whether it's refugees or whether it's immigrants coming here from Eastern Europe or from Latin America or from Asia. And every time something gets passed, there's another law that gets passed right afterwards to counteract that. So I'll be speaking on that, and I'll be telling some of the story that my grandparents, my dad, and I have gone through. So I would like to start by telling my family story. I was born August 8th, 1993, in a small town called Romita in the southwest part of Guanajuato in central Mexico. I am the fourth child out of six. I have three sisters and two brothers. So I grew up in Guanajuato until the age of 10, and then we came here to Minnesota. My dad first immigrated to the U.S. around the late 70s when he was a teenager. He was around 16, 17 years old. He did it illegally. He could walk the desert. He went back to Mexico and then created a family. But before that, I'll tell you the story about my grandparents. So both maternal and paternal grandparents made the journey north. They both participated in a program called the Bracero program. The Bracero program, the Spanish term bracero, meaning manual labor or one that works using his arms, was a series of laws and diplomatic agreements initiated on August 4th, 1942. The agreement was extended with the Migrant Labor Agreement of 1951, enacted as an amendment to the Agricultural Act of 1949. And this was a program until its termination in 1964 that was designated to help with the war efforts. Even though the United States had made the use of migrant Mexican labor in the agricultural sector since the early 20th century, such labor tended to be both migratory and seasonal, with many workers returning to Mexico in the winter. The situation changed with the involvement of the U.S. involvement in World War II, which caused a massive labor shortage in all sectors of the economy, with the transfer of much of the nation's active labor force into the various armed forces. The extreme labor shortage forced the United States into changing its immigration policy, resulting in the development of the Bracero program in conjunction with Mexico. Over the 22 years, the Mexican Farm Labor Program, informally known as the Bracero program, sponsors some 5 million border crossings of guest workers from Mexico. Many Braceros succeeded in securing green cards and legal residency, while others simply left the fields and headed for work in the cities. As of 2014, millions of Mexican Americans trace their family roots in the United States to their fathers' or grandfathers' arrivals as braceros. So this one specific immigration policy affected my family. It is important to note that both of my grandparents had families already in Mexico. So So they had to go back. They were here for seasonal work. They were here for 6 months and they would go back to Mexico. Um, if it had been in any other situation, this could have changed. If they were single, they could have stayed longer, or if they wanted to explore, they had an open country to themselves. Um, as I have told, as I have been told by several uncles and by my grandfather, Tacho, which is my mother's dad. Back then, if you had a family, your objective was to go work for a few months and then go back. There was very little interest in permanently moving north. It is important to remember that this immigration program specifically recruited young men to migrate north for the jobs during the war effort. This was in conjunction with the Mexican government efforts to have Mexicans from the south and central Mexico move north and inhabit the northern states of Baja California, Sonora, and other northern states, for fear that the U.S. would steal back that uninhabited land. Um, in the early 20th century, there was a lot of conflict in Mexico, and there was a huge portion of the north that was uninhabited. So the Mexican government was implementing policies where if a family moved north, they would get a certain plot of land where they could start a future. There was actually several of my grandparents' cousins and a brother that made that move to northern Mexico. Because back then, the Caudillo family made a life out of farming the ejido. The ejido was a piece of land farmed communally under a system supported by the state. There was no other form of sustenance in Guanajuato at the time. Some of the things that I need to mention about the Bracero program that both of my grandparents participated in is that it was the minimum wage at the time was 30 cents an hour, which if we add inflation and we adjust it to 2018, it was $4.77 an hour. That was the minimum wage, as well as some of the things that they had to provide them with housing. It had to be humane housing, but as anybody that explores into the Bracero program, there were strikes happening all the time. There was always a shortage of labor, and there was also illegal immigration happening at the time. So the Bracero program from the get-going was very controversial for the Mexican farming, because with this recruitment of hundreds of thousands of Mexican migrants, it left the fields in Mexico unattended. So the state of Guanajuato was one of the states that was most affected by this. The Catholic Church was against the immigration because it was rupturing families apart. And due to all of this, the program started in 1942, and in 1954, due to businesses from Mexico and in the U.S., they created Operation Wetback in 1954 that was supposed to kick back some of the illegal immigration and only support the migration that was going to help the war efforts. This is one of the instances where there's a retaliation to something that has been passed. The Bracero program passes for the war efforts. It gets out of line, so then they create this Operation Wetback. And just by the name, you can clearly see what it's about. The next immigration policy that would affect my family would be the program enacted by President Ronald Reagan, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, enacted November 6, 1986, also known as the Reagan Amnesty, signed into law by Ronald Reagan on November 6, 1986, as an act of Congress which reformed the United States immigration law. The act required employers to attest to their employees' immigration status, made it illegal to hire or recruit illegal immigrants knowingly, legalized certain seasonal agricultural immigrants, and legalized illegal immigrants who entered the United States before January 1st, 1992, and had resided there continuously with the penalty of a fine, back taxes due, and admission of guilt. Candidates were required to prove that they were not guilty of crimes, that they were in the country before January 1st, 1982, and that they possessed at least a minimal knowledge about U.S. history, government, and the English language. So this was enacted in 1986. Between 1942 and 1986, there wasn't really any clear, concise law that was proposed on what to do with the millions of undocumented immigrants that were in the U.S. And this is also something that needs to be mentioned, that this was the largest and really the only thing that has ever been passed by Congress to legalize immigrants. And this was done by a Republican. This was done by the conservatives. because they knew that this needed to be passed. It wasn't the perfect law, but due to this law, a beneficiary of this program was my father, along with several uncles, cousins, and family friends, who previously to this amnesty had made the trip from Romita to the U.S. illegally. The trek was either taken in several forms, by crossing the desert on foot, as my uncle Chava, Delfino, Jose, Alberto, and my dad did, or by being smuggled in a vehicle, or swimming the Rio Bravo. What's really interesting is that the family members that crossed the Rio Bravo, none of them knew how to swim. In Romita, it has a population of 50,000 people right now. There's not a single public swimming pool. We don't have lakes. There's usually a drought, so it's very uncommon for people to know how to swim. If you're going to learn how to swim, you have to go to a different town or be rich and have a private pool. My sister made this, so I never made any trek because my dad applied for residency for all of us. But my older sister was 18 and married and had a 6-month-old kid. Due to those things, she wasn't allowed to come here legally because she was married and she was no longer part of our nuclear family. We all made the trip north to Minnesota in 2002. My sister made the illegal trek in 2003, about 6 months after we did. And Jason, my oldest nephew, he was 6 months at the time. My sister didn't know how to swim, and she swam across the river because she wanted to join her family in the new country. It is things like this that people are not aware of. Illegal immigrants come here and do this. They don't know what's behind it, and they don't know that it breaks families apart. So the other thing that my uncles also told me was that the trek was relatively easy. There wasn't really any border patrol agents as much as we like to think because it's such a long border. It is 1,000+ miles long. It's just impossible to have that. So for them, they had a specific route in the desert of Arizona. It was very dangerous, but them being young and naive, they always thought it was an easy thing, and they didn't think it was anything wrong with it. My uncles made it all the way to Idaho. There's actually like a funny story in my town that we were the first Mexicans to be in like that town of Idaho, farming potatoes and growing the economy of the U.S. There's still several cousins that are still in Idaho, and there's like a large population of like the Caudillo family that's there. My dad worked in the potato farm as well. So all of my uncles, like every single one of them, it's 7, and my dad, 8, they have all made the same trek. 7 of them benefited from this thing. Okay. Again, it is important to remember that just like the Bracero program, the U.S. government acknowledged the need to provide a clear law that would provide legal status to millions of immigrants, this time a permanent pathway to nearly 3 million immigrants. This wasn't everybody, but this was 3 million immigrants that got an opportunity to have permanent residency and a pathway to citizenship. That was the first time in the history of the U.S. for immigrants coming from Latin America. As we all know from American history, this was accomplished early in the 19th century through Ellis Island. There was a clear pathway for that. But in the 20th century, this was the first time that amnesty had been shown to undocumented immigrants coming from Latin America. Predominantly, there's still a lot of immigrants from Asia. There's a lot of immigrants from West Africa. But this was the clear pathway to 3 million immigrants. Since 1986, there's been several policies that have been passed. For example, the Immigration Act of 1990, which was a response to the law of 1986, which set an annual ceiling of 700,000 immigrants for 3 years and 675,000 thereafter. Currently, that's around the ballpark of how many immigrants we accept to the country. And this was a response to the amnesty that was given to 3 million people. In 1996, another law that was passed under Bill Clinton was the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act that broadened the definition of aggravated felony and increased the number of crimes classified as uh, such, so immigrants could be deported for a wider range of crimes. The law applied is reactively, so the act also increased the number of Border Patrol agents and established an expedited removal procedure to deport immigrants without formal hearing. What's important about this is that this was during the Clinton administration. He's usually looked up as a liberal, but this was sort of like a stance that how tough he was, and made it very very difficult for undocumented immigrants to obtain any sort of social benefits, and made it a lot more difficult for them to get under the system. Uh, so the other thing is that increased, oh yeah, Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act sharply cuts legal permanent residence eligibility for many public assistance benefits, including food stamps, supplemental security insurance, temporary assistance for needy families, and Medicaid. In 2005, the real I okay. To summarize that part, again, it was to make it more difficult for undocumented immigrants to get any social benefits. Right now, nationwide, you can't get any benefits if you're undocumented. I'm an interpreter, so I work primarily in hospitals, but I also work for the county. So countless of times I've helped families filled out an application for, whether it's insurance, whether it's food stamps, or whatever social program that we have in the state of Minnesota. And every single time it's heartbreaking. If they have 3 kids and one of them has been born in the U.S., the other 2 kids are not eligible for anything except for emergency situations. And under the state of Minnesota, you can apply for emergency Medicaid, health insurance. But aside from that, you can't get food stamps. You can't get public assistance for housing or anything if your kid was born outside of the U.S., if it's not a citizenship. And it's heartbreaking. You fill out this forms for this single mother that's having 2 jobs and is struggling to put food on the table, and their only one kid is eligible for benefits because he was born in the U.S. and the other 2 are not. So that was one thing those are 2 of the things that happened after 1986. There's always a drawback after a law gets passed. Another one was in 2005, the Real ID Act requires states to verify a person's immigration status or citizenship before issuing licenses, expands restrictions on refugees requesting asylum, and limits the habeas corpus rights of immigrants. So from 1986 to 2005, not a single proposal was passed to provide immigrants a clear path to legal residency or citizenship. The acts passed only further squeezed undocumented immigrants into the underground and made the entry of refugees a lot more difficult. So in 2014, President Obama announced that he was taking executive action to delay deportation of some 5 million illegal immigrants. What's also we have to make clear about this is that under Barack Obama, we had the highest deportations in the history of the U.S. So while he's giving not amnesty, but delaying the executive order of deportation about 5 million immigrants in the media, he's deporting and breaking families apart like it has never done before. If you look at the human rights violations that were committed from 2008 to 2015, it's insane. And this was under a Democratic elected president. So it's been on both sides of the aisle, whether it's Republican or Democrat. They have always used the immigrants as a political pawn. We want to look tough on crime. We want to do this and make up myths. On the part of Social Security, undocumented immigrants contribute 10% of the budget for Social Security, and they will never see any of the benefits from that. But again, under the new policy, people who are parents of U.S. citizens or legal residents will receive deportation deferrals and authorization to work legally if they had been in the U.S. for more than 5 years and passed background checks. Obama's action also amended the 2014 Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival programs, which is the next policy that I wanted to talk about, which allows people under the age of 31 who were brought to the U.S. as children to apply for 2-year deportation deferrals and work permits. Obama's policy change change lifted the age ceiling and added a year to the deferral period. 26 states challenged the executive order, and in February 2015, a federal judge issued a preliminary injunction temporarily blocking the provisions of the executive order while the states pursued a lawsuit to permanently shut down the program. In 2017, in a legal battle, the White House attempted to impose restrictions on immigration from several Muslim majority countries in conflicted regions. Successful legal challenges from different states and cities saw a significant decrease in the scope of immigration orders. So the reason I mentioned that is because, again, it's these drawbacks. And then I'm going to go into depth and give you an example of what it takes to be a DACA, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And again, these were children that came to the country. These were kids that came into the country before they were 18 years old. They've been here for a period of time. And the requirements to be under DACA are you are under 31 years old. As of June 15, 2012, you first came to the U.S. before your 16th birthday. You have lived continuously in the U.S. from June 15th, 27 until the present. You were physically present in the United States on June 12, 2012. And at the time you apply, you came to the United States without documents before June 2012, or your lawful status expired as of June 15, 2012. You're currently studying or have graduated from a high school or earned certificate of completion of a high school, or have been discharged from the Coast Guard or military. And then again, this is like the third law that has affected my family. So it was from the Bracero programs and my grandparents making the trip north and then going back to Mexico. Then it was my dad and my uncles going to the U.S. when they were teenagers for a better life. They got amnesty in 1986, the majority of them. And then now the kids, some of the kids or my cousins who came here when they were children are DACA recipients. And the thing that is interesting about DACA is that now we're in limbo due to the president and Congress not doing anything about it. And it's policies that always affect families and then break them apart. And the reason being, again, is just political pawns from both sides of the aisle. You know, do you guys have any questions? One of the things that I really wanted is to answer any questions that you guys have about immigration policies. I'm familiar with some of them. So do you guys have any questions?
You say that the provision of DACA was those dates of entry and complete high school training?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So it's and not
Yeah, no, it's and. Yeah.
I entered illegally after that date, but I'm not in school.
No, then you wouldn't qualify for that. Yeah.
How about your sister who came here and crossed with a baby?
Yeah, so that's Veronica. She's 2 years older than Areli, the one that you know. Veronica was the only one in our, so 6 kids. 5 of them were born in Mexico, and the baby of the family, Rafael, was born here in Minnesota. I was 10 years old. My younger sister was 7. Areli was 17. My brother was 18, and Veronica was 19. Under the provision that my dad applied for, it took him about 12 years to get us to the U.S. My sister married when she was 17. So once she married, she was no longer under my father's family. So she was ineligible to be on the same paperwork that we were on. So we came here in 2002, and she was left behind in Mexico with a 6-month-old child, and the family was gone. So she made the trek 6 to 8 months later, illegally. My parents hated that. My dad wanted her to wait because he had done the same thing. He walked the desert, and he didn't want his oldest daughter to risk swimming a river, not knowing how to swim with a 6-month-old child on your back. So yeah. Thankfully, she got her paperwork in order, but it took nearly 12 years for that to happen. And she classified under a visa called the U visa, which is a visa specifically for people that have suffered some sort of crime or have been witness to a crime. So in order to classify for this visa, some horrible thing had to happen to you in order for you to be eligible for that visa. Because otherwise, there's really no pathway. So if I'm undocumented and if I want to be documented, there's no really line that I can get into. If I have cash, then I might hire a $5,000 to $10,000 private lawyer that can make a case for me, saying that I have special requirements for my job, or I can get a sponsor. But there's really no pathway to become legal. That's one of the misconceptions that a lot of people have. Why don't they do it the right way? There really isn't no right way. Like, something horrible needs to happen to you. You need to be an entrepreneur. There's a visa called the U2, I believe. And that's a visa specifically for entrepreneurs. It never gets filled up. There's always like a certain amount of numbers. I believe it's 5,000 visas that get put out every year. They never get filled out. The requirements for it, you have to have an investment, and you can't take any loans out, and you have to provide a certain amount of jobs each year. But they never get filled up. There's no visa for just like the average undocumented person where you can say, I'm going to go to immigration, and I'm going to get my fingerprints and do a background check. There's no such thing. There's no such thing. Any other questions?
Do you know what happens to some of the people who are deported?
Yeah. Several of my cousins have been deported. If you get deported, well, you just get on a plane, and then you get sent back to Mexico or wherever you're from. That's really all that happens. It started. So in 2008, there was a huge migration from Mexicans starting in 2008 with the Great Recession. So right now, like Mexican immigrants coming to the U.S., it's actually like a net zero because there's more Mexicans going back to Mexico than there are Mexicans coming to the U.S. for economy. But the Mexican economy is doing fairly well right now. And also, there's like a change of culture in Mexico where the government is explicitly educating children in schools about, not going to the U.S. For the violence, for the risk of crossing the border, and because they want to keep the young people in Mexico. They want them to participate in the economy and make the country better. So that's what happens for the deportees. They just go back. There's a sanctuary in Tijuana, on the border in Baja California with San Diego, and there's like a huge amount of like people that get deported that just stay there trying to cross again. But again, that's like a mix of all immigrants from Mexico, Central America, and South America. So if you get deported from Ecuador, that's a long ways. If you have a family here and if you want to come back and risk your life, pay a criminal $5,000 to cross you, it's a long way. Any other questions? Yeah, I'm an American citizen. So, okay, I'll explain this. We obtained residency. So when we came here, we came under a visa. After 2 years, we became residents because we were all under the age of 18. If you're under the age of 18, after 3 years of residency, you can apply for citizenship. And that's what I did. That's what my parents did. I was 14 when I became an American citizen. And I didn't have to do anything because I was underage. So all I had to do was sign a paper, and I became an American citizen. But yes, I do go back to Mexico. My grandmother's still there, all of my cousins and aunts. And I have 3 nieces and my sister-in-law that still live in Mexico. My brother is here half the year and then goes back to Mexico to live with his family. So I still go back. There's none. Yeah. No. So this is what happens when, as an interpreter, this is one specific clinic that's very popular with people that don't have the documents. What happens is they can't call it an interpreter because since they don't get any benefits, the insurances will charge the hospitals themselves if they use an interpreter. Small hospitals there's one specific one called Southside Clinic, Community Clinic. if there's a person that doesn't have documents, then they can call an interpreter for them, and they can interact with a doctor if he or she doesn't speak English. So what I've done in the past, I just stay. It doesn't hurt me to stay 10 extra minutes to interpret for a person. Like it's, but yeah, if you're undocumented, you don't really have a reason. Big hospitals like Alumni, they won't really ask. But if you're going to Alumni, you usually have insurance and you usually have the documents. Uh, but I mean, there's like, yeah, there's like nonprofits like in Minneapolis. There's quite a bit of them. There's the Volunteers Lawyers Network. They always represent people. I've worked with them in the past, but then again, there's no government entity that's helping them. In 1996, when this passed, uh, you know, making it more difficult to obtain benefits or any sort of health insurance, the University of Minnesota created this emergency healthcare system of sorts for undocumented immigrants, especially for the children. But again, if you're undocumented, you're not educated, you don't speak the language, how are you going to find out that the University of Minnesota has this program where you can have healthcare? It's really, really difficult. So, yeah. Any other questions? Uh, yeah, I think it's definitely been helpful. I think when Minneapolis did, and St. Paul both said that they were going to be sanctuaries. I think it definitely helped. But then again, it's sort of just patching things up, sort of like a band-aid to cure cancer. And the cancer is the fact that our government is not doing anything about the millions of undocumented immigrants that help and contribute to our economy. And there's a lot of myths about just undocumented immigrants. And I wanted to bring just like the top 10 myths that they have, but I didn't want it to become a lecture. You can look all of this up. You know, if somebody tells you that undocumented immigrants are committing crimes at a rampage, it's just not true. You can look at the statistics. You can look at the studies that have been done, and immigrants usually have some of the lowest crime rates in the country of any population. And one of the reasons is because they're afraid to interact with the system. So they both underreport crimes and they just don't commit crimes as much because they're just afraid that they're going to get deported, that their families are going to get broken apart. So it's for those two reasons that usually crime is either underreported or they're just not even being involved in the system. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Can you speak at all to the detention centers that are holding refugees from Central America? I mean, there's been quite a bit of news about
That one is really tough to read and to do anything because like the statistics for like Central American immigrants is just terrifying. It's just really, really, really terrifying. There's some statistics that say that up to 80 to 90% of the women that come from Central America through Mexico get raped. And I mean, that's just terrible. So you go through that and then you cross the border, but you get detained in these detention centers where you get there, you stay there indefinitely sometimes. There is no lawyer representing you. There's nothing. You can be there for months at a time in horrible conditions, you know, with tons of human rights violations. So that's a huge problem that's happening in the border. And that's a huge thing that the media is not really reporting. You know, every once in a while they might have a report about, you know, a horrible crime that committed or something, or like a violation by somebody that detained a refugee for, you know, a whole year without, you know, without any really reason. So there's a lot of violations with the detention centers. And a couple of reasons is because they're understaffed. Right now, like if you want to become a Border Patrol agent, you can sign up. If you're 18, they will immediately hire you. It's really ridiculous because they're so understaffed with every resource as far as immigration, and whether that's immigration agents or whether that's people in the detention centers. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, so again, my dad first came here in the late 70s, and then went back to Mexico back and forth, married, had a family, and when I was born in 1993, he sort of decided to move to the U.S. permanently because it was, you know, 4 kids now, and he needed to make more money. So From about 1992, 1993, he decided that it was going to be permanent. Applied for citizenship. It took him 8 years. He became an American citizen in 2001, and about a year and a half later, we made the move to Minnesota. My dad first came to Minnesota in 1999 because he was working for the Tyson company. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with Tyson. And they shut the company that he was working for in California, and they either gave him an option: we either give you $500 or we can give you a new job in this state called Minnesota. So my dad, of course, took the job and moved to Minnesota along with my aunt and my uncle. So they've been here since 1999. I think my uncle was the first one that came here. He was in 1997, and then my aunt and my dad made here in 1999. We came here in 2002, 2003. And when we came here, it was a different planet. I knew nothing of the U.S. It was playing soccer and like bugging my sisters. That's all it was for me. I was a kid. I didn't know anything. It was really, really strange. The thing that was super difficult for me was the culture shock, but as well as like just being around my dad, because I didn't know him. It was just a person calling every Friday to send us, $100 so we could live. So that was super strange, like being around my dad and growing up in Motley first. Like I remember the first month I couldn't sleep because it was so quiet. Like it was so quiet. It was a different planet for me. And then moving later to Staples, it wasn't much better. So it was difficult. It was always like a culture shock, and just it always felt like I was living in two worlds because I would go to school and I would try to fit in and speak English. When I first came here, I didn't speak any English, so that was like a struggle because Mali didn't have any Spanish instructors. So I graduated in 4th grade in Mexico, and I was like the number one in my class. And I went from that to repeating 4th grade in Mali because they didn't have any Spanish instructors. I went from like number one kid in Mexico to the dumb kid in Mali because I didn't speak the language. So it was like a whole year of just like my little sister and I meeting every day with an instructor named Tony Spam, who had retired the year prior, but had to come back just to help us learn English. So for the first year and a half, we were never in the classroom. And we were just in this room all day with Tony's fam, which was great for us because we learned English, but it was also really difficult, like trying to learn the language, make friends, and just live in a new world. So that was tough. The winters, it was, oh my God. The first day that my sister and I saw snow, we were like super excited. So we went outside and started grabbing snow, and it was so cold. It sounds stupid, but we didn't know. It just looked so pretty. We made a snowball. And I remember the first winter when my sister touched the snow, her fingernails fell off. It was like her first 3 fingernails, they just fell off completely. My skin was bleeding. Like it was like my body just didn't like the snow. So it was hard. It was hard. It was always, not being able to relate to people. And so it was difficult, but yeah. Any other questions?
Learning the language and becoming bilingual, and you said you also have to word and worded.
Yeah.
Do you know of anyone who didn't know enough Spanish
Oh, yeah, that's.
to return to Mexico, but were still
Mhm.
deported?
So I have 3 cousins that were living in South Carolina. That was 2 boys and 1 girl. The husband got deported, so she had to make the trek to Mexico. So she sold the house in South Carolina, went to live in Romita with 3 kids that didn't really speak Spanish. So they were in middle school. They spoke basic Spanish. They never really learned Spanish because they didn't interact with that many Spanish speakers, and their parents were always working, so they never really learned the language. Sort of like the same thing that my little brother has, because he understands Spanish, but it's hard for him to like say the right things. Or he does Spanglish, where he mixes words in English and Spanish. So when he goes to Mexico, my cousins don't understand him. So that has been difficult because there's been several cousins that have made the trip back to Mexico. They just said, "I'm done. I don't want to. I'm not welcomed here, and I'd rather struggle in Mexico than live in the U.S." So they made the trek, but their kids hate it. or they just have difficulty because they they grew up in the U.S. speaking English and American culture. So yeah, that does happen quite a bit, and because of all the like the Mexicans going back to Mexico en masse like never before, that's probably fairly common for the kids that grew up here. Any other questions?
Are you ever afraid that you'll be portrayed as a pedophile? Or are you comfortable sharing any experiences
Yeah.
of when you or your family has ever been victims of nature bullying?
I mean that if anybody growing up in Staples like knows, it's just a small town, so any sort of thing that's gonna make you stand out is always gonna, you know, there's always gonna be that bully. Uh, so that was always just I sort of got used to it, I guess. And I had really good outlets with sports, and I had a really small group of friends that I'm still friends with. So I didn't go through a lot of it, but I did, and I think it was just like any other kid getting bullied, except my bullying was because I looked different or I had an accent. Uh, Racial profiling, that's happened several times in stores or, you know, I think when I was here in the CLC, I got pulled over a lot of times and for no reason. But I think it's because they confused me with like a Native American. And if anybody knows the Brainerd Police Department, they were probably racial profiling me for thinking that I was Native American. Uh, so, but it hasn't happened a ton of times, thankfully. And living in Minneapolis, I think I fit in a lot more. So, yeah. Any other questions?
You live in Minneapolis now?
Yes. So I live in Minneapolis. I graduated from high school at Staples Valley High School in 2012. Came here from 2012 to 2014. Actually had Gary Payne, Scott Foster, Sarah Kath, if you guys can take her classes. She's amazing. Jeff Johnson, he's an amazing instructor. So yeah, then in 2014 I transferred to the U, and then I graduated with a major in sociology and a minor in philosophy from the University of Minnesota in 2016. And a couple months after I graduated, I started working as an interpreter, a Spanish interpreter, primarily in hospitals, just helping people, navigate the system. I'm not sure. I think it was like I'm 17 years old and I just had a kid. I'm getting married. I never really asked her because I think she's a little bit bitter about that. So I'm not really sure. Yeah. But I don't think any of us, like none of us knew what was going on. We just knew that my dad was in the U.S. trying to get us to the U.S., but I never had any idea of how that worked. I remember my mom would just have, she would tell me, ask your dad when she's going to bring us. Ask your dad when he's going to bring us. And years later, like when I found out, the bigger story, like I couldn't imagine my dad hearing that every weekend. Like, so I'm not really sure if my sister knew.
When are you going to run for public
Never. My long-term goal is to become a lawyer, immigration lawyer, because, oh my goodness. So that's my long-term goal. If I do any sort of, it would be not public office, but public policy. I would love to be in there and tell the representatives what's going on. Unfortunately, in the state of Minnesota, we have nearly 500,000 Latinos, but there's not a single representative. There's MINCLA, which is Minnesota National Council of Minnesota Latinos, something like that. And there's three people that work for 500,000 people, trying to propose things for education, for economy and stuff. So I would love to do something like that in the long term and just try to make a difference. Yeah, but never public office.
Kind of a personal question, but you just mentioned that maybe the police officers is looking for Native American. And I know that a lot of Mexicans have American Indian heritage. I know one of your good friends is Lakota.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, do you feel that connection in any way with being that you've been people that have lived on this continent for thousands of years? Do you feel a connection with the Native peoples of Minnesota, or is your past too distant?
It's probably way too distant because I'm a mestizo. I remember this, our like my family's Catholic, so they do the Catholicism, but it's mixed in with these beliefs that stem from our indigenous roots. And my grandparents specifically, my two grandmas were very very like that. My grandma from my mother's side, from my dad's side, is from the mountains, so she probably has like a stronger connection. I've always just been curious, and I think the connection is just being a minority and just having like a sort of sense of a similar background, whether it's economics or whether it's just being the only person in the room that looks different. I think that's about as far as it goes. But, and the reason I mentioned that is because when I asked a couple people here at the CLC, like I would get pulled over from like coming at like I would get out of the movie theater and I would just get pulled over. I remember the most absurd one. I pumped gas and then I pulled out and then I got pulled over. I was like, what? Like it was never like it was just annoying. It was like I'm just pumping gas, and then somebody made the comment is like they probably think like you're Native American, like so they're just yeah. So that's why I made that comment. That's what I was told. Any questions? Any other questions? No. Thank you. Thank all of you for having me. I feel like I owe this to the CLC. I had an amazing 2 years here. I didn't specifically like Staples. I love cross country and track, but as far as like learning, I felt like the CLC was an amazing place. Whether it was Scott Foster, Gary Payne in sociology department, or the philosophy department was amazing as well. Jeff Johnson and all the poets that he brings here. So. Jan Kurtz also. The first time that I talked about my grandparents in a paper was in her class, and so and then knowing Tracy for years now, so this was awesome.
Can I just say, if you're curious to read, this guy is an avid reader. He's reading left and right, and some of it was from the influence of some of the instructors we have here. But if you're curious about and sometimes it's through the stories that are told. Ask for some recommendations. Some of the instructors here have some great recommendations. Antonio could probably give you some good. I asked you what to read.
Yeah, I think like sharing the stories, the personal stories, and not just seeing a statistic, because when they tell us that that we're rapists and that we're criminals and that we're making this country horrible. But do you know anybody that comes from Mexico and that's doing that, or anywhere from Central or South America? There's always going to be those people that commit crimes. But for the majority of the biggest reason that they come here is for a better life, to work, to bring food to the table, to send money to their families, to make sure their grandparents are alive, and they think you have health insurance. So. I think connecting those stories and just knowing people will just give you a greater understanding. Anytime you want to learn about statistics or anything like that, or studies that are not, from either party, you can always find them anywhere. And there's some amazing books out there. Seth Holmes wrote an amazing ethnography called Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies. He spends several years, with Native indigenous people from Oaxaca going to the state of Washington and lives with them and tells a story from their perspective. So there's amazing works of nonfiction ethnographies that are out there if you want to learn anything about that. So. No, I have not. I'll check it out. Yeah.